Hi, my name is Katie Weatherup and I'm a shamanic practitioner, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about this kind of weird, wacky world of entities. And so if you're someone who's not experiencing entities, please go watch a different video because it's one of the things that there's a lot of fear and misconception about, and if it's not on your radar and not of concern, that's great. And for most people, it really isn't a big deal because the design of the healthy, normal human energetic system keeps these things out. Now, some people are just wrong place, wrong time, and they get something really big and gnarly attached to them, and it's something I can definitely extract or remove. But my most complicated clients, frankly, are the ones who have a lot of entities, who have been dealing with it for quite some time and are really, really struggling. And if you're someone who's in that position, first of all, I just want to say I'm so sorry. It is a really scary, lonely, isolating, unpleasant kind of experience to have. And you're in a society that mostly says this doesn't exist. So when you try to seek help or talk to someone about it, there's a lot of reactions that are very negative, that tell you you're wrong or you're mistaken. So there's almost a pain around needing to be heard. And at the same time, what I've noticed about the people who specialize in working with this is they haven't necessarily been really rigorous in terms of understanding what works and what's effective and how you apply these modalities to clearing things. And so there's a lot of I don't know, kind of the shotgun approach. So whenever I talk to clients, sometimes they've read a bunch of stuff online, and some of it I'm like, yes, this is a completely sound energetic principle, and others of it I feel like wouldn't be all that effective. So I'm going to share a little bit about my take on entities. Hopefully this will give you some more information if this is something that you're dealing with about what would be helpful, and help you to sort whether I'm a good person to work with or you feel like you'd be more aligned with someone else. I really like co-creating win-wins, and frankly, entities is the hardest place. So in knowing that, I want to share that. Now, when I say entities is the hardest place, it's not because I have a hard time clearing entities. For me, really basic kind of work. I've been doing this for 17 years. I'm very, very good at it. The trouble is that there's a lot that goes with it that makes it more complicated. So to break some of that down, like I said, the healthy human energetic field isn't particularly vulnerable to entities being attached. So the people who can get cleared and then a day later they're having entities again, they're having all the same symptoms, are kind of like people who have a really weak immune system. So doctors, could end up treating, the pneumonia or the virus or whatever illness, but they would really struggle overall to help somebody who is really vulnerable to catching whatever viruses. Just, being out in public's a big deal. My grandmother went through chemotherapy, and it was a huge risk to her just to go to the supermarket. She wore a mask. Like, being exposed to a normal healthy person wasn't a big deal, but an older woman on chemotherapy, any illness could be a death sentence. So it was this really, really huge deal. The normal viruses that most of us, maybe we get a cold in the winter, our immune system fights it off, not a big deal. That isn't the experience of someone with a compromised immune system. And it's similar with entities. And there are a lot of things that can make someone have a compromised energetic field that prevents things from intruding. And one of the things I would say is entity attachment is usually a symptom of some other underlying issue. So it's one of the things that happens that shows up, perhaps one of the more awful things for people who are really uncomfortable with this, but it's something that reflects a need for healing at a deeper level to solve the core underlying issue. So as a result, I only do entity healing in the context of a soul retrieval. I also call it compassionate entity removal. So if I'm going to work with you, just expect that you're going to need to book a soul retrieval. And what I find is if someone's dealing with heavy-duty entities, you'll do a lot better if you book 2 sessions. So an initial soul retrieval followed by a shamanic healing session, because there's just a lot of layers usually to go through. And even then, even if you do the 2 sessions with me and I do a lot of clearing, expect that there's going to be homework. I think it's very hard for someone who's dealing with a ton of entities who've gotten attached to them to resolve it on their own. So you should definitely have, whether it's me or someone else who's good at this work, an ally in terms of getting these things cleared off and wrangled and protections and calling in better guides. It's really, really hard to do without an assistant. But the flip side is, I can only do a piece of it, and so there's a certain amount of rebuilding your energetic and auric field that's an inside job. And so there's a book by Ted Andrews called Psychic Protection that has a lot of recommendations for how you can use your awareness and your intention to build better protections. I also really recommend people have protected space, create wards, which is spelled W-A-R-D-S. And that's an energetic barrier around where they sleep, and good shamanic hygiene to clear their own energy field and clear the energy of where they sleep to help protect. And again, these are things that I can help with, but if someone isn't able and available to do consistent practices, it's very hard for me to have lasting results. So I get uncomfortable sometimes when people are, sort of spending their last dollar in a desperate attempt to resolve this really scary, uncomfortable thing, because what I know is it's a journey. Just like rebuilding your immune system is a journey, it's probably going to be a journey. And I found that, daily practices are just hard for all of us. A lot of people don't do their homework. I remember teaching a class, and my friend and I who were teaching it went into the hall to use a bathroom, and we hear people whispering, "Are you doing the homework? Are you doing the homework?" And nobody wanted to admit to our faces that they weren't doing the daily practice that we'd said was so important. But most of them weren't. And if you're having overall a really good life and you're not drawn to daily practice, then that's okay. But for the entity thing, it's probably going to be required. Now, some of the things that results in an energy field that is really vulnerable to entity attachment. Some people just get born that way. There's people who just don't have as strong a bubble. An abusive childhood, a lack of safety needs being met, definitely can compromise your energetic structure. What we put into our bodies, excuse me, makes a pretty big difference. So people who've done meth for a long period of time, there's ways that destroys the subtle body and does damage. And again, if you're somebody who's been on meth and gotten sober and really wants some help with this, I'm happy to help, but know that it's a bit of a road to rebuilding your energy body and making it healthy and strong. A persistent use of other substances just depend on the sensitivity of the person and the pervasiveness of the use. So I've seen people who have really heavy drinking patterns for a long period of time not have entity issues, and some that do. Also ayahuasca. I know people really, really feel drawn to it, and they can have these profound, beautiful experiences that are really rich. But I cringe because most of the ayahuasca journeys that take place, the container isn't strong enough. Like if you're doing a journey with a group of people, even if the shamanic practitioner or the shaman who's holding the container closes everything else out, there's still the concern of the person detoxing stuff next to you and that getting inside of you. So I cringe a little bit about a lot of the stories, because for the same reason a surgeon would be upset about a non-sterile environment for surgery. And frankly, this just is the work of experience. I've taken a lot of entities out of people who've done ayahuasca because they get so cracked open and then other things can get in. And again, it's not the end of the world, but it is an energy leak when you're dealing with this kind of thing, and it's very psychologically impactful. One of the challenges is, all my teachers have said, it's way easier to clear an entity than to convince someone that the entity is gone. And there's some real practical reasons for this. I have a background, I was an engineer before I was a shamanic practitioner, so I'm very pragmatic. How do things work? What's repeatable? And I really ask my guides a lot of questions about, like, why is this? What's going on? And there are a couple of answers that explain it, but they're unfortunately not easy answers as far as like, oh, now that I understand this, it's super easy to resolve. I wish that it were. There are a lot of aspects of work that I can do that have really instant results. And this one, if it's a deep condition, is just hard. It's just harder to do. Again, it's super easy for me to sweep in and clear all the entities that are attached to you. It's just that I can't, outside of you, create the protections that will prevent you from, sort of getting reinfected, so to speak. The other part of it is when you have things attached to your auric field, they do damage. And so if we had a cut and we went to the doctor and we got it bandaged or we got stitches, we would understand the next day that it still hurt. We'd be like, well, of course, it's healing, At some point it itches, there's this whole healing process. Well, similarly with damaged spots in your auric field where things have been attached that didn't belong, there's a healing process. And when you're feeling entity attachment, usually you're feeling a lot of energetic sensation. Your energetic senses are telling you something's there. And so you're still getting pings on those energetic senses as the damaged places heal up. So it feels like there's still an entity there because the place that was uncomfortable or not right or whatever your cue was is still resolving whatever was attached. The other part of it is this weird quirk of our brain. So if your brain has been trained to pay attention to entities, and because of sort of the stigma of saying I'm dealing with entity attachment, and the fact that we're not really trained in the discernment of our perceptive abilities of energy, most people don't get help instantly. There's kind of a process where they try, more private things. Well, how about if I sage my house really well? How about if I do this? They work with it on their own first. And again, there's just a lot of material out there that isn't helpful, that isn't really super effective. And so by the time they come to me, if this is a major presenting issue, they've trained their brain to pay attention to watching for the potential for an entity. And what's really hard about our energetic pathways is for someone who hasn't been trained in their psychic abilities, and there's places to get rigorous training, but most people just have some gifts that don't get validated. It's kind of like, the kid can make any noise, like the noises in any language, but the dominant language, the language that they're being raised with, they get validated for. So when the kid says something that sounds a little bit like mama, all the people get excited. And when the kid makes a noise, if they're, in American culture with American parents who are teaching them English, that would be good in Chinese, nobody really pays attention. They don't get any extra reinforcement. So similarly, there's this ability to perceive things psychically that we don't get reinforced, like we don't get validated when we perceive something that's there. It kind of operates in the background. I think it's kind of a crazy societal agreement that this whole area of perception just doesn't exist. And while we develop our mental body, like we learn trig and we learn algebra in school, we don't learn basic, like how to make an energetic bubble around us. How do we, not stick cords into our lovers? How do we not give away our soul parts? Like these kinds of things, we don't learn this whole aspect of ourselves. That is the society we live in, so that's the case. But the upshot is that the people are not trained to differentiate between perception and projection. And unless you've done a lot of shadow work, one of the things that I've noticed about people who have a lot of energetic sensitivity but haven't done shadow work is they'll have a lot of wild stories about people attacking them or people with feelings, and when I go look at the actual situation, it may or may not be true. It's kind of a 50-50. And yet they're utterly convinced. And I would argue that as humans, we don't read our senses necessarily 100% correctly anyway. So you can have arguments with someone where both people were present for a conversation and actual words were said, and there are two people who remember it completely differently and are absolutely convinced that they're correct. And you haven't even gone to the psychic realm. So the upshot of this way that we process information and the way that we're super biased toward our own perceptions, even when they're incorrect, is that the mind kind of can reproduce the sensation because the attention has been so focused on it. So you're driving down the road at a random moment and your brain's like, pay attention to whether they're entities, and it can actually even produce the stimulation. So it makes it really super complicated, and I have so much compassion for people who are in this place because they literally can't trust their own perception. Their own perception is not reliable because of the damage to the auric field, because of the way the brain deals with this, because of our ability to create a sensation. A good example of this, if I say head lice, you may have an urge to scratch your head, even though your lice status has probably not changed in the time that I brought this up. Like our system, when it tunes into a concept like that, can have a visceral response. And it makes it really sticky and complicated, and who do you trust, and you can spend a lot of money and not get a lot of results, and it's just a hard place to be. So who's a good match to work with me? Well, first of all, you should go into the session knowing that if I do a soul retrieval for you, your energy and your power will be returned to you, which will help with the immune system issue, because if you're filled up with your own soul parts, much harder for other things to come inside you. But there's a really solid chance you could wake up tomorrow feeling like nothing has changed. If you want to spend the money, you'll probably get more value for it if you're willing to do the homework that the guides recommend. It's different for everyone, but there's probably going to be some significant commitment of time and energy in terms of developing this system. So the same way that someone with a depressed immune system would be getting lots of sleep and drinking lots of smoothies and, you know, eating lots of greens and cutting out sugar and flour or whatever their protocols were, there's a lot that just needs to happen as far as daily practice to build this system. So you'll get better results with that. If you're somebody who really truly believes that there's absolutely nothing wrong with you, it's only an outside force, we're probably not going to be a good match, because I'm going to be treating you from the standpoint of what's the underlying cause that left you vulnerable to this thing, and how do we not only get rid of the thing, but also repair that. And if you're coming from the standpoint of somebody just needs to clear all this stuff and I'll be fine, there are no life changes, there's no way that I'm participating or being in the world that isn't supportive for being free of this experience, I probably can't help you. When I'm dealing with people, there's a real correspondence toward vulnerability to entity attachment and mental illness. So you take schizophrenia as example, and what's horrible is mental institutions are places that tons of entities hang out, because people who are unbalanced to the point that they need to be hospitalized, that they can't interface effectively with mainstream culture, have all these like rips and tears and openings and give off all this crazy energy, and things get attached to them. So I would argue that some of what these people are perceiving really is there. We just don't have a psychological model in the mainstream culture that deals with that aspect. And so it's a hard situation. But the more you're dealing with mental illness, again, the entities are a symptom, not necessarily a root cause. And I'm not saying that everybody who has mental illness, or everyone who has entity attachment has mental illness, but there are a number of people who have entity attachment, mental illness, and don't believe that they have mental illness. And those are like my least favorite clients to work with. Like the only time in the whole history of my practice that someone has ever been abusive is this guy who came to me with entities, and I gave him my whole disclosure, you know, you may feel the same, and here's why. And he later confessed in session. I'm like, well, wait a minute, we talked about this. He said, oh, I was so out of my body, I just didn't even hear most of what you said. And then he's screaming at me that I lied to him on this voicemail, and I'm like, wow, this was not fun. You know, this is this really unbalanced man who, and I can understand, I can have compassion for, he was really frightened and had tried a bunch of things and they didn't work, and at the same time he hadn't done any of the homework I recommended. He had a recording, he hadn't listened to it, and then he was projecting his anger outward, and you know, I was like, you never get to work with me again, we're done. And I'd rather not have those experiences at all. That's absolutely, utterly not okay with me. And so if you're somebody who has, in the heat of the moment, had occasion to yell at your practitioner about the lack of results, please give me a pass. It's just not a good match for me. I will heart and soul do my absolute best for people, but if you're not at a place where you can maintain, you know, levels of of kindness and politeness and those kind of things, which some people are. Like, it can get so acute for a variety of reasons. I'm just not going to be a good match. I need people who are at least at that level where they're able to participate with me in a kind and respectful way. So that's like one of my bottom lines. So anyway, I hope this is helpful. Even if you don't work with me, please consider the book by Ted Andrews, Psychic Protection, Getting Your Space Warded, Having Good Shamanic Energetic Hygiene, where you're doing space cleansing. These are all things that will really, really help. And if you do decide to work with me, like I said, it will be a soul retrieval session. And if you've gotten through to the end of this, thank you so much for listening. Again, my name is Katie Weatherup, and you can learn more about me and my work at my website, which is handsoverheart.com.